Hey everyone, I hope you're having a great holiday season, and today I'm very excited because we're going to talk about False Orders! It is one of the spiciest cards in the entire game of Root, and we're going to talk all about why. If you remember from my top 10 favorite Exiles and Partisans deck cards, you'll remember that False Orders was my number 2 favorite. It almost made number 1, but I think that False Orders is so broadly popular and it's so many people's number 1 favorite card that I kind of wanted to choose an underdog surprise answer, and I went with League of Adventurous Mice instead. And I do really like League of Adventurous Mice. It is my favorite card, but False Orders is just right there. And we're going to talk about all the different reasons why. But one big reason is because I think the Exiles and Partisans deck, the implementation of it, really broadened the different crafting strategies that you see in the game. If you're familiar with the cats, then you know that when you're playing the base game, it's almost guaranteed that the optimal path forward is double bunny crafting, because there's just so many good cards that are costing 2 rabbit crafting pieces, from Cobbler, Command Warren, Better Burrow Bank on top of the coins. But when they made the Exiles and Partisans deck, now all of a sudden you see cats going single rabbit, or 1 mouse, or 2 mouse, or what we call Fox Crafters Guild, which is 2 fox crafting pieces, and you'd almost never see that with the base game. Only with Exiles and Partisans deck, because there are some really cool cards that are in the fox suit, or specifically the cats, but also other factions. And yeah, False Orders, really cool card, and today we're going to explore why it is that's the case. So let's read what the card says. I just want to point out that there's a little bit of an errata to this card that you can find in the How to Play guide. Weirdly not the Law of Root, the How to Play guide for the Marauder expansion, and it's only in the wording. It effectively works the same way, so you can still use the wording here. It's totally fine, it's functional, but just know that it uses the word force. It's a new keyword that was introduced in Marauder. So this is a fox card, of course, as depicted on the art as usual. It costs 1 fox crafting piece to craft, and the effect is, I'm going to read the corrected version. In Birdsong, may discard this card to force half an enemy's warriors from any clearing, ignoring rule. Okay, so it is allowing you to basically take half the warriors rounded up from 1 clearing and push them into an adjacent one. And that is really, it sounds pretty cool on paper, and it's even cooler in practice. So we're going to talk about all different functions for why that might be the case, why that might be very powerful. So there are 2 copies in the deck, so it's semi-common. It's not one of the rare cards, which is very exciting. So the odds of just drawing it are pretty good. And there are endless possibilities for how to find utility with False Orders. And another thing that's cool about the Exiles and Partisans deck is that it rewards advanced and clever players for finding these little creative ways to play with rule, or to maybe influence the board in unexpected ways. And False Orders is probably the king of these creative plays. So it can allow you to regain rule of your own clearing just by moving enemy warriors away from a clearing, giving you back rule of your own pieces. And it can create rule problems for others. Right? If somebody else requires rule to do what they're going to do, you can use False Orders on them, and all of a sudden they might have to coalesce their forces again, or that might actually be impossible if they don't rule the 2 clearings, the origin or destination of that breakup that you did. It can help you split up a blockade. So blockades are a term that I'm going to use throughout this series to mean when someone brings 5, 6 warriors into a clearing that is really hard to overrule, right? It might be hard to battle through it. It might be hard to move through it. But if you're able to use False Orders, you can just split that blockade up, allowing you safe passage through. And the nice thing is that this is action neutral. It's not going to be eating into your action economy, especially for your action-sensitive factions like the Corvid Conspiracy or the Marquise de Cat. And it can help you to expose cardboard. So if you have an enemy building that has 4 warriors or 5 warriors that are defending it, that's going to be kind of hard to break through. You need 2 or more really good rolls in order to get through. But with false orders, half of the defenders are gone, and now there's only 1 or 2 warriors defending it. All of a sudden, you can maybe get at that building and open up the building slot for whatever you need done. And the Sabo ability is moderate. I'm saying moderate because even though the power of this card is so high, it has a similar level of game-breaking, oh no, oh no, oh no, don't use it on me, please, please. It has that same feeling as a favor card, though of course it's way less devastating than a favor. But they can only use it on one faction, and it's single use. So you use this False Orders card, and then it's gone. Meaning, if I have the Saboteurs card, am I really going to use my 1 Saboteurs to take away their False Orders? Because there's a chance that they wouldn't have used it on me anyway. You have to kind of evaluate, is that False Orders going to be used to really hurt my game? Or are they going to be able to win the game somehow with False Orders? Then, of course, you might consider it. But if someone just has False Orders, I might be careful about using my Saboteurs on a False Orders if I'm not likely to be the target of it. So just keep that in mind, that False Orders can occasionally get saboteured, but it's still something that is typically allowed to survive for a few turns before the warning lights start going off. We're going to start with the Marquise de Cat as usual, and the things that the Marquise de Cat can do with False Orders are that you can regain rule of your wood path. So let's say that I have a nice network of sawmills and clearings that I rule, all connected to nice building slots, and someone marches in with a blockade to completely cut off my wood path. Normally what you'd have to do is either battle, which is risky, or use a march action to accumulate warriors into that clearing to overrule the blockade. That could leave some of your backline sawmills and other buildings underdefended, and it's also using up an action. But False Orders allows you to just regain access to all of your building slots and regain rule of your wood network, and it's action neutral. Marquise de Cat loves things that are action neutral. Doesn't cost you one of your 3 precious actions, and then you can go ahead and build on a turn when you might not have been able to without False Orders. And of course, even though the Cats are not a primarily offensive faction, if at some point you reach a stage in the game where all the building slots nearby are filled up with enemy buildings, False Orders can be useful to just go, why don't you guys go away? That way I can now more easily battle and open up that building slot nearby, and I can continue my building infrastructure. Right? So this can be super useful in a game that is very claustrophobic, when you have Eyrie Dynasties, Woodland Alliance, and Lizards in the game that just make that fight for space a lot tougher. But False Orders can really unlock the map for you as the Marquise de Cat. I love this card, and it is an A rating card. I only say it's not S because there are other factions that can do bananas interactions with it. The Marquise de Cat uses False Orders in more or less traditional ways, right? Just playing with rule, taking away an enemy's defenses, which is kind of how False Orders was envisioned. But the things you can do with other factions are kind of even cooler. So we're going to reserve S tier for those guys. All right. Next up is the Eyrie Dynasties. It can make opening up building slots easier, similar to the Marquise de Cat, where the Marquise needs to build up more buildings to score points and to get their wood tokens off the map, so it's less cardboard that an enemy could score points off of. But for the Eyrie Dynasties, putting down a building is the difference between life and death. It's turmoil or being able to go on to win the game. So for them, being able to remove enemies from a defended clearing to then open up that building slot and plant a roost is crucial. And sometimes you just want to use that False Orders to ensure that you're going to be able to get through to that building slot, because bad rolls can really haunt you and make the game a lot worse, even if you have multiple battles. It can also clear the way from movement. So it's not often that you see the Eyrie Turmoil on move. Usually a good Eyrie Dynasties player can get the moves done that they need to not Turmoil on move. However, sometimes you have something to accomplish on the other side of the map, And if there's just a blockade keeping you from being able to move through to get to the rabbit clearing to do your battle or something, then that could really be a cause for turmoil. And false orders can help you get around that by breaking up rule blockades. And this is really cool. If you have a suited battle, let's say you have to do a rabbit battle, it can be very easy for the enemies to say, hey, let's just everyone get your stuff out of rabbits for one turn. That way the Eyrie won't have something to battle in a rabbit clearing. This works unless false orders is in the game. This actually happened to me in a tabletop simulator game about a year ago. Shout out to Granatap, where he had false orders crafted and a suited battle. And we spent 5-10 minutes just discussing how we can turmoil the birds, because otherwise they're just going to win the game. And there was no way to do it, specifically because false orders was sitting in his play area, basically as an insurance policy that we could not get in the way of that turmoil on battle. So sometimes, like a lot of these different single-use cards, the threat that that card creates just by existing is stronger than the execution. And yeah, that means that there's all kinds of different ways that false orders can be used by the Eyrie to evade turmoil. It can help you evade a move turmoil, a battle turmoil, or a build turmoil. The only thing that it doesn't necessarily help with is a recruit turmoil, but League of Adventurous Mice does really nice things for that. Check out that video. But because avoiding turmoil is such a key part of Eyrie Dynasty strategy, I'm going to give this an S tier rating. If you can craft false orders, if you're clever, you can almost guarantee that the table won't be able to force you into turmoil. Sometimes if you see a God of War Eyrie that's just on a rampage, the only way to stop them is a coordinated turmoil that the table is able to figure out and maneuver by doing just the right things. But false orders throws a whole wrench into that plan. So a God of War Eyrie with false orders can kind of be unstoppable, or will at least take a great amount of effort to figure out. S tier. Next up is the Woodland Alliance. So, important to note, not just if you're a Woodland Alliance player, but if you're playing in a game with the Woodland Alliance, if you move an enemy with false orders, it's the enemy that pays outrage, not you. Even though it's your turn and you spent the card, you physically might have moved those warriors, it's those warriors that triggered the outrage, and therefore they pay. That is a really important factor of why false orders is so good, even if Woodland Alliance is around. But it works even better if you are the Woodland Alliance player. This might be my favorite card as the Woodland Alliance, even more than Propaganda Bureau, which we will get to, just because of all the cool little things that you can do with it. So something you can do is you can use it to move enemy pieces onto a sympathetic clearing in order to supply you with a supporter card. And of course, it's activated during Birdsong, which is when you spread sympathy. So you can just say, oh man, I just need one more supporter to be able to do a spread or a revolt. Okay, well, I'll just use my false orders, boop, walk some enemies into my sympathy token, and now, thank you, I'll take one of your cards into my supporter stack, and all of a sudden, I can continue on spreading sympathy. So the timing of this card is so powerful for Woodland Alliance because they have an involved birdsong. And you can also, if you're really afraid of enemy warriors, like they have a big stack and they're right next to somewhere where you could or will revolt, well, move those 4 or more warriors right on top of that sympathy token, and then you can do the revolt and kill a whole bunch of warriors that were previously safe from the revolt because they weren't even in the clearing with the revolt. So, I've seen this done to otters, and it is painful. Just half, sometimes 3 or 4 Riverfolk warriors being moved onto sympathy and then just killed instantly. Pretty bad. Like they didn't even deserve it because they were not the ones who were causing the outrage. They weren't in the clearing. Very powerful. And it effectively removes one of the primary counter Woodland Alliance strategies, which is camping on the bases. If you're playing against top-level players as the Woodland Alliance, a very common strategy is for them to bring 5 or 6 warriors and just park them right on top of your base. making it impossible for you to rule your own base so you can do the classic evening move a warrior, organize. So the only way out of that normally is either Corvid planners or to recruit a whole bunch of warriors, and of which the Woodland Alliance only has 10 to work with, and then battle, which is really inefficient. The Woodland Alliance hates doing battles, especially if all they need to do is just rule their clearing to get out. But with false orders, you can just move half of those warriors off and regain access to your bases. And because you have false orders crafted, your enemies won't even try to camp on your base. So again, just the false orders existing prevents your enemies from doing certain things against you, knowing that it'll just be undone. So another example of the threat being more powerful than the execution. S tier card. If you watched my playthrough video as the Woodland Alliance that I put up just the other day, you'll see that I used false orders in a really creative way, just like this, where I needed to do a revolt against the lizards. So I just moved some cats, they triggered outrage, I got a card, and was now, voila, able to do the revolt against the lizards. If you are playing the Woodland Alliance, craft this card, please, because an opportunity will arise. Next up is the Vagabond. Now the Vagabond is, like in a lot of cases, a little bit funky when it comes to things that involve warriors. So an enemy cannot use false orders against the Vagabond, right? Because the wording is specific. Move half of an enemy's warriors. So you cannot use false orders to force the Vagabond to move. Although I don't even think that would be terribly useful because they have slip. So not that you want to do it. But what about if the Vagabond wants to craft false orders? Well, Vagabond doesn't really care about rule, so this false orders use is typically going to be used to cause some kind of chaos. And it'll help you do all the normal things like expose cardboard or interfere with what an enemy's trying to do, things that any faction would look at, so there's not that much of a specific interaction with the Vagabond in that regard. However, there are still a few uses for it that I found. One is if you're able to just move a lone warrior, right? There's one warrior in the clearing, but that warrior is hostile to you. Normally, you'd have to spend 2 boots in order to move your Vagabond into that clearing. Because, if there's a hostile warrior, it costs 2 boots to move into that clearing. But if you have false orders and you really, really, really need to save that boot for an extra move or to aid or something, you just need to only exhaust 1, you can use false orders to move that 1 warrior out, and now you can just move into that clearing, and since there's no warriors, you only spend the single boot for the action. It won't work if they have 2 warriors, because of course half of 2 is 1, so there will still be a warrior, so it's very situational, but it's an interaction that I thought of that, it could be useful. It only costs 1 of your hammers, so if you have a leftover hammer and you're in a fox clearing, why not? You're certainly not going to want to aid false orders to an opponent who can craft it themselves because of the massive advantage it gives them. Speaking of aiding, it can help you set up an aid location. I did this just the other day where I really needed to aid the Riverfolk in order to get the item that I wanted from them, but the Riverfolk wasn't really nearby. So what I did was I used false orders to force the Riverfolk to move, and of course, you can force the Riverfolk to move downriver, so that was really interesting. To move the Riverfolk down the river into a clearing that was on the path that I was intending to take, and then moved into that clearing, and I was able to aid them. So if you're doing some type of aid strategy, or if you just really need to get that hammer from an enemy, but they don't have any pieces in rabbit clearings and all you have are rabbit cards, you can use false orders to move them into a rabbit clearing, setting them up for an aid, to take items, or to get points, or do whatever you have to do. So that's a really singularly useful thing with false orders. It's more likely to come up than this lone warrior to evade the boot tax for hostile, but that's another reason I thought of. So I give this a B ranking. If I have a leftover hammer, I will probably craft it, partly to keep it out of the deck so that other enemies won't draw false orders and use it for themselves, but it could be useful, and it's not expensive to craft, so hey, why not? Next up is the Lizard Cult. And this one is pretty cool. So, because the lizards rule their clearings as long as they have gardens, they rule the clearing unequivocally. You can split up a blockade. You can divide a ball of warriors, an otter ball, for example, move them onto your garden clearing, and now they are effectively stuck. They cannot get out unless they rule one of the other adjacent clearings to move out. And depending on the situation in those clearings, that could be really hard to do. You can effectively trap them on your gardens and keep them from moving away. And then the only way for them to move out would be to completely demolish you. So don't do this if you have 3 warriors, but if you have 6 warriors defending a garden or 2, then those Riverfolk warriors or Eyrie warriors, for example, could have been very useful, but instead now they're just going to have to battle down all of your warriors, which just gives you acolytes, and they're probably not going to make it anyway. So that is something that you can do. And if you are not the lizard cult, it's even better because it kind of forces entanglement between those two. I've done this to great effect where I've just moved a whole bunch of Riverfolk warriors onto an enemy lizard cult, and now they're both kind of in trouble because the Riverfolk's only escape is to just battle the lizard cult away. It was glorious. Keep that in mind. Another interesting thing is you can move into an outcast clearing for convert. So if the outcast is currently rabbit, and I really need to convert some warriors so I can defend my garden or start building up infrastructure in my garden clearing, but there's no enemies there, well, I can just move them into move enemies into a rabbit clearing, and all of a sudden, hey, now you guys are ripe for conversions. So think about using that in conjunction with your outcast and your conspiracies. And speaking of which, this is the secret. This is the really cool little lizard cult interaction with false orders. Because this card says, in Birdsong, may discard this card. And in games with the lizard cult, what happens to cards that are discarded? They go to the Lost Souls. And when is the Lost Souls tallied up and used to influence the outcast? In Birdsong. So you can theoretically, if you are the lizard cult, on your own turn, you could say, wait, before, right? Because it's not the start of Birdsong that the outcast changes, it's just the first step. So you can use false orders before that step and say, okay, before I count up all my Lost Souls cards, I'm going to use false orders, boom, to move those guys there. Doesn't even matter. You don't even have to care about what it is you're moving. But now, you're taking that false orders, which is a fox card, and throwing it into the Lost Souls, which could be just the right amount of fox cards to tilt the outcast over to fox, or to tie the outcast to keep it what it was. Whatever you need to do, false orders is a really cool card that is able to secretly manipulate the outcast. And if you do this in a game, people will go, oh my god, I didn't even think of that. It's one of those brilliant little root strategies that people don't even think of right away. But when someone pointed it out to me, I went, that's so smart. And again, shout out to Granitab. What he told me is that you can actually use this after the first step of the Birdsong phase for Lizard Cult. So after you, tally up the cards, but before you discard. So you can actually change the outcast, then use false orders, and then do the second step of Birdsong, because they're not tied together in direct sequence. You can use false orders between those two steps so that false orders never affects the outcast if you really don't want it to be fox on this turn or the next, right? And of course, you can also just use false orders after the end of your Birdsong so that there's just going to be an extra fox before your next Birdsong's shift. So that's just a really fascinating little interaction with false orders, and I'm going to give it an S tier. Just because having more direct control over your outcast is just, sometimes it's the difference between having a terrible Lizard Cult game and having a great one. For the Lizard Cult, anything that gets around RNG, just randomness, is going to be super, super helpful. That's partly why dominance swapping is so important for lizards, because if it weren't for dominance swapping, you'd be completely at the mercy of RNG. Random number generator, if you're not aware. But Dominant swapping allows you to turn your bird cards effectively into suited cards so you can actually score and you're not completely at the mercy of randomness. So the fact that False Orders similarly allows you to get around randomness is why I'm giving it an S tier. Next up is the Riverfolk Company. Riverfolk can sometimes be trapped away from the river, which can make movement and escape really impossible. And so, yeah, False Orders can allow you to split up your enemy's blockade, re-gifting you rule of the offshore clearing where you are and get back to the river. So that's something the Riverfolk does care about rule in certain situations in order to escape. But also, if you use False Orders, you can manipulate rule of your opponents in order that they rule the clearing that you need so that you can spend their warriors to place a trade post, right? Anything that has to do with rule is going to matter for the Riverfolk Company when it comes to spending warriors for their trade post. You want to know something? I literally thought of that just now, so it's not going to appear in this presentation. I just thought of it on the spot. And so my B ranking, I think I'm just going to have to move it up to A, honestly, because, yeah, if I have only Eyrie warriors, and the Eyrie don't really rule anywhere because they've been overruled by opponents, I can just say, well, I'll use False Orders to move all those cats away, and now the Eyrie rule that clearing, I can now spend these Eyrie warriors to place this trade post. I can't believe this didn't occur to me before, but there you go. False Orders, A tier for the Riverfolk. Not to mention all the other normal stuff like battling cardboard that's defended. You can just get those defenses away and battle because the Riverfolk does like to pick off any easy victory points from cardboard. Underground Duchy. There isn't really any type of special interaction with the Duchy that I was able to think of. It's just a generally useful card. Of course, the Duchy sometimes need to be able to rule in order to move so they can get to their clearings for the purposes of sway, but so do a lot of factions, right? They all need to be able to move to accomplish their things. So not really any special circumstances or special teams with Underground Duchy, so I'm giving it a C rating for now, but maybe I'm wrong. I'll fully admit I haven't played enough Underground Duchy games, so we're going to go with C for now, but I'm willing to listen to reason and upgrade or downgrade it depending on what kind of feedback I get. So if you have an idea about how it can be useful for Duchy, put it in the comments. Next up is the Corvid Conspiracy. This is bananas. So, the Corvids are the only faction that crafts in Birdsong, right? And this is not at the start of Birdsong effect, this is in Birdsong, meaning you can craft this card and use it on the same turn. So every other faction has to craft False Orders and wait a full turn to use it, so everyone kind of has at least one turn to respond to it and say, oh, I better bulk up my defenses in case of False Orders, because every other faction crafts in either daylight or evening. The Corvids are the only faction that goes, I'm crafting False Orders, and now I'm immediately going to use it to do some crazy crow shenanigans, and that makes this interaction particularly spicy. I like it. But what can we do with it? Well, we can do a surprise extortion for once. Maybe you have an extortion plot that's face down that you're of course aware of. Well, with False Orders, you can craft it and then spend it to move some enemy warriors onto that extortion just before you do your flip, which is step 2 of Birdsong, and now you're stealing a card from their hand when you normally wouldn't have. Or if you were already stealing one card from one enemy, you can pull enemy number 2 into that clearing and take 2 cards from each of them. Very, very cool. Or you can also bomb half of an enemy's warriors from that clearing, or snare them, or something like that to make their army stuck. All kinds of wild things can happen when you are playing creatively as the Corvids. And let's face it, you kind of have to play creatively if you want to have a chance at winning the game as the Corvids. So, S tier, being able to use a card that's this devastating without your opponents having any kind of forewarning, they can't respond to it, it just happens, insane. And so advanced players that are playing against the Corvids have to be very aware of that possibility at all times. So if I'm playing the Corvids and I see they have a Fox plot, I go, where are all the False Orders cards? Have they been discarded? Are they in the Lost Souls? Are they, are they in the Decree? So be careful of this surprise false orders when it comes to Corvids when you're playing against them. It's that powerful, it can be that devastating. Next up is Lord of the Hundreds. So, Lord of the Hundreds famously are one of the factions that actually prefer fox crafting, partly because of informants, which we'll get to. They also really like the fox items for their horde, but False Orders is another great one for them. It can make oppression easier. If there's a clearing with 3 warriors, I really want to battle through all 3 of those just so that I can oppress the clearing. Why don't I just use False Orders and whoop, move 2 of them away, and now I just need to battle 1, and I oppress that clearing again, so I can help with my scoring engine using this card. That seems pretty intuitive. But another really cool effect is if you want to use looters, you can use False Orders to expose a single warrior, or even better, a single cardboard. If you can create some type of small little enemy, it's going to be a lot easier to use looters, because if the only opportunity is a stack of birds or lizards or something that have 4 or 5 warriors, you're going to have to bring an awful lot of warriors if you want to loot them and take the item. You probably won't even do that. But if you can use False Orders and move just to get 1 out or 2, preferably 1, you can bring 4 rat warriors in there and use looters, and you're almost guaranteed to be successful with your looters attempt. So False Orders works really well for the purposes of trying to loot an enemy. Really cool. Keep that in mind. And so for that little interaction, I give it an A tier. Makes oppression easier and makes looting easier, which are both very important things if you want to have success with the Lord of the Hundreds. And the last faction is the Keepers in Iron. The Keepers famously like to use as many cards as they can for recruiting or putting into the retinue, but False Orders is one card that I would seriously consider crafting. And there are a few reasons for it. One is that it can break up an enemy blockade to make it easier for you to delve or recover. So similar to the Lord of the Hundreds, you're not going to succeed with looters if the enemy has 4 warriors, right? It's just not going to happen, and you might end up having to battle and roll 3-2 or 3-3 and lose a lot of your own warriors in the process. Or wouldn't you rather just split up that clearing, and then that allows you to delve and be forced to only battle 1 warrior? Might make sense. Or you can just split up a blockade in order to give you rule of the 3 clearings you need to recover several relics without actually needing to discard the card from your retinue. It is something you're going to have to think of at the very start of your turn, right? Birdsong is... It feels like the Keepers in Iron's turn is an eternity, but Advanced Keepers in Iron's players have to think through their entire turn before they even start with their in-camp, right? From before you take your very first action, you have to think about what your plan is for the turn, so that does make it a bit complex, but if you're an advanced player, False Orders can make that calculation a lot easier. And of course, the Keepers in Iron depend on migrating throughout the woods, right? Once you've got all the relics from your backline, from your around your homeland, you need to move on to bigger and brighter things. And a blockade is a really good way to stop the Keepers in Iron, who have the live off the land trait, where they lose a warrior every turn if they have too many warriors, right? They can't really bulk up and overrule that easily for moving around the map. So blockades are a really effective way to keep the badgers from going through a choke point. But False Orders can be useful for the badgers to escape and get some presence onto another side of the map, opening up access to way, way more relics than they could have ever dreamed of. And for those reasons, I think it is a borderline S, but I think the interactions are maybe not game-breaking S tier like with the Woodland Alliance of just getting yourself a free sympathy in time. So very, very strong card, and highly recommend you give it a try. It will probably save your bacon and could end up winning you the game as Keepers in Iron. Maybe that is S tier. I don't know. Let me know what you think. So that is all of the different factions and how they interact with False Orders. So it's extremely powerful for a one-time use card, and this is one of the reasons why I love Exiles and Partisans so much, but also why I love Root so much, because it rewards creativity. so many games just feel a little bit like you know what you're supposed to do, and there's one path forward where you have to eliminate your enemy or something. But False Orders enable so many different creative plays that even hundreds of games, I'm not lying, I've played hundreds of games of Root, and I still see False Orders being used in ways that I go, that's genius, or I never saw that before. So it's just, Root is endlessly intriguing to me, hence why I can talk about it for hours, making all these videos talking about all the different cards. And here's a pro tip. Don't forget when an opponent crafts it. This is something that I see a lot of people do, and I'm guilty of it a lot, is someone else crafts it and I go, oh, False Orders. Okay, what am I doing? But if you end your turn and you left yourself vulnerable to an opponent with False Orders, it will probably get used on you, and it can ruin your whole game if you don't prepare for it. So I really like that, as opposed to favor cards, which can just be like, oh, I craft it, and now either I win or you just lose to the point where, you know, the game might as well be over. With False Orders, usually, unless it's the Corvids, you have a full turn to respond, so you actually have some type of leeway, as long as you remember that it's been crafted. And that's it for False Orders. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know. You know what? Don't just let me know if you disagree with me. Also, let me know what you found, some cool little interactions that you've managed to do and maneuvers you've pulled off with False Orders. I love hearing about those types of things. So I will see you guys next time.